Hello, everyone, and welcome to Edge Talk Radio. This is Angela Zabel, that's me, and I am talking with Paul Smith today. It is going to be a fun time because we are going to be talking about remote viewing, the Stargate program. There is so much to unpack today. So, who am I? I am Angela Zabel, and I have been connected to spirit and working with the team and the non-physical my entire life, sharing messages with a multitude of realms with people. And I am a teacher, coach, a medium, radio show host, writer, retreat host, gallery reader, speaker, and I do online and private group sessions offering guidance, mediumship, intuition, speaking engagement, and sharing knowledge with others. And I've worked with people throughout the world. I can be found on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, write for Edge Magazine, host Edge Talk Radio, and also Amazing Soul with Voice America's Empowerment Channel. You can find out more about me at angelazabel.com. And Edge Magazine is who is hosting this program, and they are the leading events and media resource dedicated to all aspects of holistic living, health, and wellness, and the mysteries beyond, sharing information, wisdom, resources, and committed to promoting businesses, organizations, and individuals who support our collective journey to wholeness and balance. You can find out more about Edge Magazine at edgemagazine.net. So today I have Paul Smith, and he is from Cedar City, Utah. And I'm going to go through his background, and I will be reading it because there's a lot to read tonight. He is the longest serving controlled remote viewing CRV teacher active today. He began his career as a remote viewing instructor in 1984, and he served for 7 years in the government's Stargate remote viewing program at Fort Meade, Maryland, from September 83 to August of 1990. He started in 1984. He became one of only 5 Stargate personnel to be personally trained as remote viewers by the legendary founders of the remote viewing, Ingo Swann and Dr. Harold Puthoff. And I got a chance to meet Dr. Puthoff, and he is so much fun.
No, it's Puthoff.
Puthoff. I just like, it's Puthoff. I'm sorry. So Paul is also the primary author of the Government Remote Viewing Programs CRV Training Manual, and served as the theory instructor for the now CRV trainee personnel, as well as the source recruiting officer with the security officer and unit historian, which I love the historian part of it. That is so cool. And he went on to teach remote viewing to such well-known personalities as Lynn Buchanan, May Riley, is that correct?
Mel Riley.
Mel Riley and David Morehouse. And Paul is credited with over 1,000 training and operational remote viewing sessions during his time with Stargate. So he was raised in Boulder City, Nevada. He enlisted in the Army in 1976 for Arabic training. He attended the Officer Candidate School and was commissioned as a military intelligence officer. Besides his tour in Fort Meade, his military assignments included Arabic linguist, electronic warfare operator, strategic intelligence officer for a special operations unit, the Mideast desk officer, tactical intelligence officer, and the collections director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the chief of the Intelligence and Security Division for the Military District of Washington until he retired in 1996. And I don't know if he actually retired. I'm questioning that one though.
I retired from one thing and moved on to something else.
Yeah. So he has a bachelor's in the Brigham Young University, and I have read his dissertation. I've read part of your dissertation. Very interesting. So we're going to get into a little bit of that today. And he is in the Mideast Affairs, Art and English, an MB for the National Intelligence University, Mideast Concentration, Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Texas, Austin. And he is specializing in consciousness and the philosophy of science and the philosophy of the mind, which I find that so very interesting because the mind is something I think is uncharted territory that we are exploring. He and his work as a remote viewer have been featured on television programs as CBS Sunday Morning, the Arts and Entertainment Networks, the Lowell Files, and the Unexplained, several History Channel programs, Sci-Fi's, the Joe Rogan's Questions Everything, on German television. On numerous occasions, he has been a guest on the Coast to Coast program with George Norrie and Art Bell, and has interviewed with Whitley Strieber and Bill and many others. He's also been featured on bonus material on the DVD release on the film Suspect Zero, which I have not seen. I'm looking forward to it. Which was starring Ben Kingsley, Aaron Eckhart, and Carrie Ann Moss. So he's also an author, and his book, Reading the Enemy's Mind Inside the Stargate, America's Psychic Espionage Program, which was in 2000 and 2005. It's also The Essential Guide of Remote Viewing and the Secret Military Remote Perception Skill Anyone Can Learn, which I have right here. So thank you very much, Paul. Awesome book. And also, we're almost done with his background. Then we're going to get into questioning him. He's also a veteran of Desert Storm, and I appreciate your service. He retired from the military in 1997, and then he went on to his next job. He founded it and is president of the Remote Viewing Instructional Services. It's now based in Cedar City, Utah, offering remote view training and basic through advanced levels. He has courses for the individuals and small groups, and he also works in the nonprofit International Remote Viewing Association. And he is also a life member of the American Society of Dowsers, professional member of both the Parapsychological, did I say that right? Association and the Association of Scientific Exploration. He is currently serving as a member of the board of directors for both the Pennsylvania and Orion Research Center, and is associate editor for the Journal of Scientific Explorations. There's a lot to unpack with Paul. I'm going to do a little segue. He also plays guitar, he sings, he has a great sense of humor. And I am going to do a full disclosure. I did personally work with Paul out in Cedar City, Utah. I did take his remote viewing class. I have his book, and I've been doing his target programs. And for all of you out there, make sure to check out more information on Paul. Go to his website, which is rvviewer.com or rviewer.com. And he's also on Facebook at rviewer. And you can also find him on Remote Viewer on YouTube, Twitter, and on LinkedIn. So make sure to check out his information. Sign up for his newsletter to keep up to date on his new classes, everything that's coming out. And now, Paul, I've worked with you. And it's been
wait. All I wanted to say is, if I had realized how long that was, I'd appointed you at a shorter bio.
Oh, I have a shorter bio, but I didn't want to do it.
Okay, then
give you all the credit.
Hopefully the audience won't blame me then. Okay, good. Go ahead.
So I've worked with you, and it was, I've got to say, doing the remote viewing session, the class in person with you, I felt was so important for me to get that personal one-on-one time with you. And it was a smaller class, and I thought it was awesome. But I want to know from you, how did you actually get going where you wanted to start teaching that class, where you wanted to actually go into remote viewing? And then first, I guess we should back up. Let people know from your perspective what remote viewing is.
Okay, so I'll answer each of those 15 questions in order.
I got 15 more, so be ready.
So first off, I've been doing I did remote viewing for 7 years in the Army before I moved on to more normal Army kind of jobs, Army and joint jobs. Then when it came to time of retirement, my wife wanted me to work for a 3-letter agency because it had a government pension at the end, and it had government health care, and it was reliable, roughly 9 to 5 work hours, and you carried a briefcase to work, right? I applied for one at NSA, an intelligence analyst position, and ultimately got turned down, for which I was greatly relieved. I mean, I bought the interview suit, I tuned up my resume, all the stuff you do to get a job after the military, right? And that had failed, and I didn't try it again because I did not want to do that. It was just seemed to me a very tedious thing. So what do I do instead? Well, about that time, so it's interesting that remote viewing only came to the general public consciousness the very end of 1995. So this was just 8 months before I retired. No, am I doing this right? Yes, 8 months before I retired, it blows up. It gets on Nightline, Ted Koppel's old show. And on the show, they had several of my old buddies, Dale Graff. I won't go into who all these guys are right off, but Dale Graff, Ed May, Joe McMoneagle, and then some other folks I hadn't met but knew about. Robert Gates, who had been both a CIA and a CIA director and Secretary of Defense. And they proceeded to spill the beans on this program that had been top secret when I was in it in between 1983 and 1990. Huge event in the media world. All of the major newspapers carried stories about it. It was on, people were being interviewed all over the place for the different, like NPR and NBC and all of the networks, small and big. And I was still on active duty, so I wasn't being interviewed by anybody. They didn't know I existed, which was that was the right circumstance at the time, much as I would have loved to set some of the stories straight that was getting garbled out there in the media space. Come time to retire, 8 months later, I applied for the NSA job and didn't get it. And then I'm starting to think, what do I want to do? Well, there's two things I want to do. Well, first off, sorry, I left the middle of the story out. And so also at this time, this was when the internet started exploding too, right? The World Wide Web has just been developed. And along with that, Coast to Coast, which became the biggest syndicated overnight radio show, a nighttime radio show in the world for a while, when Art Bell was doing it, it also discovered remote viewing. And so all of those things together it didn't make remote viewing a household word, but it made it widely familiar to a lot of people and very exciting for people who wanted to find out more about it, in fact, do it themselves. A few of my friends, former colleagues, stepped up and started teaching it. And I thought, you know what? I've been teaching this longer than anybody that's out there right now. I should hang out my shingle. And so the next thing I tell my wife, she drive down the street in the car and she looks and there's a catalog for the University of Maryland on the dashboard. She says, "What's that? Why is that there?" And I said, "Well, I was going to talk to you about this. I want to apply to graduate school." She says, "What?"
That's a great way to bring it up subject.
Yeah, that's just the opposite, of course, of a government job, right? No guaranteed income, no guaranteed health care, right? All that. We did, of course, have retired military health care stuff, but and then I said, I want to start a business. I want to start teaching remote viewing. What? She's a very pragmatic person, and at that time, I don't blame her for thinking neither of those things are realistic. We're gonna starve to death. But if you think through it, so a lot of my military friends, when they got out, they had a guaranteed career. I mean, I had Air Force buddies, fighter pilots and stuff. Airline pilot, logical segue. Army engineers get into some kind of civil engineering job. Even the admin people in the Army can get out and get administrative jobs in the civilian world. Infantry officers, they have a lot of leadership skills and experience, and they get snapped up oftentimes by companies. And me, what am I? Well, I'm an intel officer, but I'm a generalist, which means I don't have specific skills, which is why I think NSA turned me down. I had some experience, but not enough for their specialized job that they wanted, that they were hiring for. And so what am I going to do? Well, the only skill I have, and I say marketable, except even then I didn't know it was going to be marketable, was teaching remote viewing. And I thought, well, there's a low investment aspect here. I don't have to do any further training. I already know how to do this. Well, let me give it a try. And so I set up my company, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. There's more opportunity there than I can possibly have the bandwidth to realize myself. So both, I did go on to graduate school. Maybe we'll talk about that later. That turned out to be a very valuable thing. And my remote viewing company has been exactly the right thing to do. So you asked that question and you got a long answer.
Well, I never even thought about the idea. What do you do when you get out of the military, when you have the background and training you have? I never even thought about like, oh, what do you do after that? You could have just retired and just, sat in a chair for a while.
Well, as I tell people, a military retirement and a job at McDonald's and you can squeak by.
Yeah.
You can't really survive on just military retirement. It's really nice. I am not complaining, and I really appreciate the generosity of the American taxpayers for providing that. But it's not enough to actually get by, particularly if you retire at 20. Now, if I would have been a full colonel retired at 30 years, you get 75% of your base pay. That might have been okay, but I wasn't a full colonel and I didn't have 30 years. So
And besides that, we got to experience you because you had to find something. So I think it was great.
well, the interesting thing is that it did force me to try and figure this out, right? And then I feel like I've been able to make a major contribution. Obviously, it's one that brings me income, but most people, I mean, medical doctors make major contributions, and they get plenty of income for that. So I don't feel bad about making valuable contributions for other people and also realizing an income, which is, let me tell you, much less than a medical doctor's. So
Oh, absolutely. And I've got to say, I have experienced your class. I've been there in person, and you put in some long days, and you have a lot of time invested in every single one of those classes. So if anybody out there is looking at the classes and going, oh, should I or shouldn't I highly recommend it. And you're going to be immersed, but be ready to keep up with Paul because he's got he's got a lot of time.
They're challenging classes. They really are. The sad thing is that I don't have the energy levels I used to. I 70, I'll turn 71 this year. And I am surprised at how much of an energy deficit you end up with as you get older. So, and my wife has been lobbying for me to retire, but I don't know. I just can't go there, but I have cut back significantly on the number of classes that I offer. And it's true, there's other things I need to do before I check out, right? So
it's other fun stuff to do.
not just fun, but necessary. I've got probably 25 book ideas, in that neighborhood of 25 book ideas, all of which would be useful and valuable. And there's no way I'm going to get them all done. Even if I were to quit teaching today, I would not get them all done. So I just have to pick the ones that I think either have the prospects of getting done the soonest or will be the most valuable contribution, or hopefully both. And go for those, but we'll see. Yeah.
I think it'll be both, and I'm looking forward to any future books you have because, like I said, I do have Remote Viewing, the Essential Guide to Remote Viewing you wrote, and for other people, if you're thinking about getting into it, looking at it, definitely pick it up. It's through Amazon, I believe. You can get it there. So, along with some of your other fun ones you have, so make sure to check out more of Paul's books out there.
You know what? Because you've been so nice to me, I might even send you a complimentary copy of my first one, Reading the Enemy's Mind.
Ooh, that looks really good. I was looking at that. I'm like, oh man, I gotta check that one out. And at the time, I've got to say, for me, it was a series of synchronicities that led me to Paul. And I feel I've talked to a lot of other people, and that's how they find Paul too, is a series of synchronicities. So I didn't even know anything about you. And I signed up for his class like just a few weeks before it started. I'm like, hey, Paul, you got room? And then I quickly ordered his book. So I'm like, I better learn what remote viewing is. I learned a little more in depth, and so I was literally reading it on the way there. So, but it was well worth it, and it was, as long as you're willing to take the time and really be invested in yourself in this class, it is so worth it. I've learned so much from it, and I still have a lot more on learning, and I can't wait to see where it goes from there. And
well, hold on a second, and let's check your file.
Oh no!
How much you learned.
Oh, no. Bad on this one. So for those of you, if you do take this class, you will be doing homework afterwards.
Records, right? Now, I am not going to show you what's in here, but I'm going to just take a look. It's been a while, so.
Oh, man.
Oh,
So I've got to
oh.
say, I'm going to make an excuse for myself.
Angela, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have brought this up. No, actually, she did pretty well. I'm pleased with her performance here. In fact, she's got a lot of really good scores. Angela was a good find. I didn't find her; she found me, but she did actually do quite well in the class. So, congratulations.
Oh, I was scared there for a while. I gotta say, so this is really learning a new process. The remote viewing is learning a process to get into that line. And for me, it was a bit of it's like I have to relearn different things I'd already been doing because I do mediumship, I connect to the other side, but it's like I have to kind of go back in and relearn things. But there's so many tools and new ways of connecting I'm learning. So I'm very excited and excited for the next one. And by the way, Paul, the next one will be a little bit better. I'll have the format down better for you.
Well, and people should know that just finishing up the in-person part of the class doesn't finish the class. You have 10 homework assignments that you have to go through. And I find a lot of my students don't quite have it nailed down when they leave. Obviously, it's a new skill, a new thing you're developing. But by the time they're done with those 10 assignments and all the red ink that I spill, telling them what they did wrong and all that, by the time they're done with that, then they have it down pretty well. So I'm anticipating you won't have any issues by the time you're finished. So.
Oh, that's good because man, I really do. So Paul, we've been talking about remote viewing, and one of the things with this is I guess maybe you should explain remote viewing at kind of a core level and what you're doing in the class when you're doing remote viewing.
Okay, so the first question is, what is it? And what's the second one?
And then what are you doing in the class to kind of tap into that to move yourself into it?
So kind of describe what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So remote viewing, and I always struggle with a good way of describing this. And I think I've got it. And then I think, no, there's a better way. And remote viewing essentially is it's actually a skill set you develop that takes advantage of an underlying ability everybody has. You've heard psychics say, no, you have to have a gift or you can't do it. This is something you have to have a gift for, right? Now, I know there's a lot of psychics who don't say that because they know better.
I don't say that.
Yeah.
I know everybody's got it.
But everybody is psychic and I don't even like the word psychic because there's so much baggage that goes along with that. But we don't have a suitable alternative word. Maybe my biggest contribution will be to finally discover one that's the best alternative to that. But
I like that.
It hadn't happened yet. So, yeah, so we all have this underlying ability, but the trick, of course, is to get at it, to actually operationalize it, make it work for you, right? And remote viewing is kind of a procedural template or a methodology that gets imposed, that can be imposed over this underlying skill to actually leverage it and to make it work for you. Okay. And ultimately, so the underlying ability is we do have the ability to perceive and experience things that are otherwise inaccessible to our conventional physical senses. In other words, we do have the ability to perceive, observe in a qualitative way, observe, experience events, people, places, things that may be on the other side of the planet or inside of a sealed room or sealed up inside an envelope or a safe for that matter, right? Or even, and this might be controversial, but it's actually true, or on other planets. Now, obviously the other planets I have in mind here are the solar system planets where we at least have some understanding of what's there so we can verify whether you've actually psychically perceived what's going on there. There's a lot of fantasy associated with otherworldly targets. Maybe we'll talk about that later too. I don't know, but at any rate, that it's a skill that allows you to do that. And you're not perceiving with your physical senses. You're essentially using what we call extrasensory perception. Now, people get confused with that term, extrasensory. They think that means you have a sixth sense or a seventh sense or an eighth sense, whatever. It doesn't mean that at all. Mean extra in the same sense as you mean extracurricular or extraterrestrial or extra whatever. Not that there's an additional, but rather that it's outside or beyond what the base word is. So extraterrestrial means something that's not on Earth, right? Extracurricular means it's outside or beyond the normal curriculum, the standard curriculum of a school. So when we say extrasensory, we mean beyond or without the functioning of the senses. The senses are not involved in ESP and extrasensory perception. Because remote viewing is a means of applying extrasensory perception, it functions as a strictly mental effect by which we can actually access, perceive, and describe features of events, persons, places, things, whatever, that we could not possibly manage using our own senses because of being on too far away, locked inside a room, whatever. In other words, it's just a form of ESP.
And I like to say a lot of times, when you think about ESP, it's that time where, you feel like, oh, I should call somebody, or I feel like I should connect with them. And pretty soon either they'll connect to you or you'll call them and they're like, oh, I was waiting for your call. We're all connected. And I love the idea of how you do it, for one thing, because you're really taking the connotation of the psychic and all that kind of stuff, which I agree that word is kind of gives people a little the heebie-jeebies, I guess, sometimes. And to take it and put it more into the scientific and put it down into a formula and be able to work your way through it and to make people understand there's a way to get into this, a way to actually use it. And that's something that's, I think, for you have really done such a great job, because there's people out there like, oh, I can never do that. How can I do it? Like you said, we're all able to do it. And for you to say, yeah, you can, here's the formula, here's how we can work through it. And how did you come up with that formula? Because you have, and we should maybe back up a little bit with you working with Ingo, Swann, Puthoff, working with them. How did that start? And then you actually starting to create the program?
Well, yeah, I especially wanted to give credit to where this started. I mean, I'm not the giant, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. And the program originally, the whole concept started with Ingo Swann back in 1971. Ingo was interestingly, maybe you don't know this connection, Ingo was born in Telluride, Colorado before Telluride was a thing,
Really?
back when it was still a mining camp. They didn't have film festivals there. It wasn't a boutique place to go for skiing, that kind of thing.
No
He was born
sun.
back there. His mom ran a boarding house, and he grew up, helping empty the pots and stuff, whatever, I don't know. But then he and his family moved actually to Tooele, Utah. So he spent his most formative years in Utah, which is where I live now.
Wow.
Interesting irony altogether, interesting irony.
As long
But
as you're not living in the same house he did, no, you're not doing that, are you?
no, and in fact, I'm about 300 miles or so, maybe a little more from where he lived. But Ingo, he did a tour in the military in Korea right after the Korean War, I think, when he started. And then he decided he wanted to be an artist and moved to New York City. And his day job was working as an admin person for the United Nations. And then the rest of the time he was hanging out with people like Andy Warhol, right? And painting in his basement and stuff like that. He'd had some out of body experience as a kid. I mean, a kid in Colorado. His maternal, yes, I'm pretty sure it was his maternal grandmother, had herself had, and I don't know if she called it psychic, but she had these proclivities, and they skipped a generation because Ingo's mom didn't really have any patience with this stuff. But Ingo had a few out of body experiences as a kid, and his grandmother kind of mentored him a bit. Well, he gets to New York and he meets all these different, a variety of avant-garde people, both in the arts and other areas, and some of them quite wealthy, in fact. And one of the popular things then was to dabble in scientific parapsychology. We're not talking about, going to storefront psychics or gazing into crystal balls. We're talking about people doing actual research, credible people, in fact. The American Society of Psychical Research had Carlos Osas, who was a legitimate scientist, and the City College of New York actually, with a psychology professor there, Gertrude Schmeidler, was also engaged in this kind of research. And Ingo fell into that circle, and because of his background, he became one of their favorite subjects. They wired him up. They had him do all kinds of different experiments and stuff. At a certain point, he said, you know, you guys are trying to get me to do out of body, and I seem to have some success with it, but you're doing the experiment all wrong. What do you mean? He said, look, this is how you do it. And essentially he sketched out an early form of remote viewing, or a proto remote viewing protocol, right? And that's where it started. And they decided they needed a name for it because it was definitely a distinct experimental protocol from anything they've been doing. And so he said, well, I get most of what I get from vision. For some people, it isn't like that, but still, he was very visually oriented because he had a dual major at Westminster College in Salt Lake City in biology and studio art. So he was very visually oriented. He said, well, I get most of my stuff from vision, so it's like viewing. So we're going to call it remote viewing. That's where the term came from. Another thing we can talk about later is maybe why I think it ought to have been remote perception, but I won't do that sidebar right now.
I like that.
Yeah. So he's develops this experiment, and actually a couple of different versions of it, that both of which worked really surprisingly well under double-blind conditions with certifiable feedback when it was over. In the meantime, there was this young physicist. He started off as a naval officer. He got his master's in, I think he got his master's in physics. It was physics, but I can't remember which kind. Anyway, his name was Harold E. Puthoff, and Hal worked for the Navy. He was a naval intelligence officer at the time after he got through grad school. And then his naval tour time ended, and he did get a job with NSA. So he's working for National Security Agency, and they want him to get an advanced degree in physics. So they send him out to Stanford University to work on a PhD in physics. And part of the program, he said, I don't want everyone to go back to Maryland and live there again. I love California too much. So he actually resigned from NSA, which meant he had to fund his own PhD program.
Oh, that's expensive.
Well, it was, but I discovered that if you have to pay for your own PhD program, you've done something wrong. Amazing how much money they throw at you from various sources, depending on your PhD, to help you, because they want to have people with these advanced degrees. At any rate, however he paid for it, he did. And then he gets hired by SRI International, which is the Stanford Research Institute, but it had by then been spun off from Stanford, was a standalone think tank that supported government research. Reason for that was that they did nuclear weapons research and military-based research, and the student body at Stanford had become, highly hippie-oriented, and they demanded that Stanford divest itself of SRI. So SRI goes its own separate way. Hal's working for them in laser physics because he became a pioneering laser physicist. Literally, he was really one of the pioneers in that field. And
so is he actually working on the laser part of it?
Well, he was working in lasers, yeah.
In lasers. Oh, yeah. I did not know that. I learned something new.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about Russell later, but Russell was also a laser physicist, although at the master's level. But he had this idea of experimenting with tachyons because, he had a physics degree that was involved very fundamental physics. And so he's interested in seeing if he could verify these still hypothetical particles called tachyons. And it involved, that gets way too complicated. So I'm just going to cut to the chase here. It happened that he'd sent a proposal to a guy named Cleve Baxter in New York. And Cleve was essentially a polygrapher. He was a pioneer in the lie detector field, right? And even into his 80s, he was still contracted by both the CIA and the FBI as a consultant on the use of polygraphy in lie detectors. But Puthoff had sent a letter to him because of some of the research he was doing, asking some questions. And Cleve it's I've heard two stories. Hal thinks Cleve showed the letter to Ingo, who he was working with too, who Cleve was working with Ingo. And Ingo says that he was in Cleve's office or someplace and the letter fell on the floor. He picks it up and looks at it and reads it and says, he writes to Hal and says, well, why do you want to do it this way with Cleve when you could have an actual psychic like me who could report on what the experience is? Hal said, well, that's kind of interesting. Yeah, and nobody's going to understand that because I didn't explain the whole background, but that's enough. You have enough, right? And so Hal thinks about it and says, well, it's certainly worth a try. He wasn't particularly, wedded to any kind of ESP connection here, but he thought, well, we can experiment. It didn't cost anything, except maybe plane fare. And so he brings Ingo out, and all of Hal's friends said, well, if you're getting the psychic, you have to be very careful they're not fooling you. So here's the safeguards you should take. And he did. He made sure he had an absolutely airtight experiment that there's no way Ingo Swann could possibly know the circumstances. Now, they were going to test PK or psychokinesis. This is what people call by the old term, telekinesis. It's the wrong word. It's not telekinesis, it's psychokinesis. Again, something we can talk about later if you want. It's a bit of a soapbox for me if people screw that word up. But psychokinesis, PK, mind over matter, that was what the base experiment was. And so they go and experiment on it. It's a very complicated scientific device in the basement of the physics building at Stanford. And despite being totally blind to what the device even was, Ingo succeeded in not only affecting it mentally, but also he was able to describe the internal components of this thing accurately. And the design of this had never been published. There was absolutely no way Ingo could have known what it looked like inside. And yet he was able to describe it. And so Hal wrote up a little informal paper on it, circulated in his circle of friends, and the CIA got a copy.
No.
Now, they were interested in this kind of stuff, not because they believed it was real. They were interested in it because the Russians the Soviets, I'll call them Soviets, the Soviets seemed to believe it was real. Now, we get hammered because we spent somewhere between $20 and $25 million of taxpayers' money over 23 years on this project, roughly about $1 million a year, right? We get hammered. Oh, look at that waste of taxpayer money.
It's not much.
The Soviets were spending hundreds of millions of dollars on this kind of research.
Oh,
more than 10 times what we ever spent in this. And the CIA was puzzled because they didn't believe it mattered. It made a difference, and that this thing was, ESP was not useful. And here the Soviets are spending all this money, and Soviets are very pragmatic people. They might have been wrong on a lot of things, but they didn't tend to throw money into something they didn't really have high confidence that they get something out of. And so the CIA really needed to know why they were doing that.
I think the return on investment was very important to them.
If it worked and we didn't realize it worked, we would be at a massive disadvantage. And so the CIA wanted to verify it didn't work, so they'd be reassured. So they saw this paper. Hal was working for a classified laboratory that supported government projects, military and government projects. He already had a clearance, so they decided they would do a contract with him, and Ingo was a source for it, and whatever. They set up the program, and that's where the whole Stargate thing started. And that was it's the first feelers from the CIA were in 1972. The program actually started getting funded in 73. And there was a long history after that maybe we'll touch, but that was another very long answer to a short question. So sorry about that.
Well, it's kind of funny because like a week ago, I actually saw a program where they were working with Ingo Swann, and they were working with a submarine where they went down and took a submarine and to see what was on the finding a shipwreck with all of your program. And it's like, oh, this is quite interesting. It comes up just before I'm coming to interview.
Perfect preparation. Yeah.
Absolutely. So when you started doing this, you were working with Ingo, and you've been doing this for a while. So, you talked about how Ingo got involved in this, but how did you get pulled into this whole thing? Because you weren't really, let's say, I know you were connected to so many things, but how did you pull into that picture?
Well, first off, you say that, I just realized this September will be the 40th anniversary of my recruitment in the program.
Wow, congratulations. How
Done that
cool.
now. Yeah. I'll have to have a big party in September.
That'll be fun.
Yeah. So I had never put the words remote and viewing together. I had no idea this existed, as did almost everybody in the world. Almost nobody knew this existed. As a kid growing up, I'd actually I liked science fiction, fantasy, and I enjoyed science fiction that involved characters with ESP. Andre Norton, who's had telepathic cats in some of her stories,
No.
and Zena Henderson, who had her stories about the people who are these aliens that look just like us, but they had psychic skills, right? I enjoyed those, and I had this hope that that maybe ESP was real, right? And then in junior high, I had the opportunity to test that. One of my fellow students created a science fair project testing ESP using the Zener cards, these ESP cards. They got the wavy lines. If you ever watched the first opening scenes of the first Ghostbuster movie, you'll have seen examples of these, right? Circle.
Well, they have it in Ghostbusters. I didn't realize.
Yeah. The very first. Well, yeah, I won't detail that scene. It's really hilarious. But they use the Zener cards, the ESP cards, and so it was a total failure. The science fair project was a total failure. Nobody showed any evidence of ESP at all, including me. I'm a total bust. And so out of that, I determined that, well, maybe there's nothing to ESP after all. It's a fun device in science fiction novel, but there's nothing to it, right? And later on, of course, I heard stories about Uri Geller, who was bending spoons, and all the exposés about him, which some of them turned out not to be real exposés. Others were. I mean,
and for those of you, I've got to say, for those of you who are watching YouTube, if you look behind Paul's head, you'll see some paintings that are back there.
Oh yeah. That's well, we can talk about that later too, because the inspiration for those is over my head there. I tried to position myself so he wasn't right there, but that's where he is.
You got Ingo Swann right there.
Yeah, that's a photo Ingo gave me, actually. Oh no, it's more than 10 years ago, maybe almost 15 now. It's great. It's a great picture of him, signed and everything. But yeah, but he was the person who actually inspired me to do the kind of paintings that you can see back there. Another story maybe for later. So I decided ESP wasn't real, which I want to temporarily contrast with a science fair experiment my son Will did when he was 11, in fourth grade, however old he was in fourth grade. And it involved remote viewing, and it worked, and it freaked his teacher out.
They did it at school?
Oh yeah.
Oh my, oh, that would be.
He was expected it would be a failure, which, in science, a field experiment is useful. It tells you things, right? Useful
Right.
things. So they don't mind if a science fair project fails. It's always better for the kid's ego if it doesn't. But, but how many science fair experiments freezing super balls and then having them shatter? How many of those fail? They're all pretty successful, right? So
Right.
this one, she figured, oh well, this one isn't going to work, and then it did, and she didn't know what to do about that. Anyway, but yeah, there's interesting contrast. But at the time, I didn't have that second point, the second data point.
But what a difference when you talked about the evolution of consciousness, when people were ready to hear things, for them to even allow that in school, to even have that there. What a difference in what their and people perceptions of it.
Yeah, I don't remember how it got vetted, or if it even did get vetted. It may have been kind of a laissez-faire thing where they essentially allow the kid to try anything,
Right.
and see what happens. To me, that would be the right thing to do. They shouldn't have any kind of a benchmark that you have to pass in order to get your science fair project in the base level, in a regular grade school science fair project. Now, later on, for
Absolutely.
maybe the county level and the state level, that's a different story, but
Right.
for just the entry level, they shouldn't have any kind of restriction. So anyway, so I'm going through life thinking there's nothing to this. And then I get to Fort Meade finally after a tour in Europe and becoming an officer, tour in Europe, captain's course at Fort Huachuca, and then here I am at Fort Meade as a Mideast desk analyst working Mideast problems, mainly Iran. And unbeknownst to me, I moved in next door to the operations and training officer for the Stargate program. That was Skip Atwater. And
Funny how that works.
it's really interesting. It's very much interesting. Across the street, one of their remote viewers in training, Tom McNair. And I couldn't get them to tell me what they did. It was just really bizarre because they wouldn't even tell me what intelligence discipline they worked in, which at Fort Meade is common knowledge of intelligence, and you can always say whether you're a human or a sig inter or a phot inter, whatever. You can always say that without giving anything at all away.
Right.
Tell me that, and that was puzzling. So anyway, whatever. What I didn't know is that they had a new contract with SRI to train some more viewers. They were looking around, they were assessing. This is not something you go up to Army Assignments Branch and say, we need a captain to be a psychic spy. It just didn't work, right? So they were evaluating their largest pool of intelligence officer acquaintances and looking who might be a good choice. And then I move in right next to them, and they see that I'm into art. Well, they were looking for Army officers, intelligence officers that were competent in the intelligence world, that had their intelligence skills well honed, that kind of thing. But then added interest in some kind of what we might call right brain pursuit, like music, like fine art, like creative writing, like languages, and that's not quite so uncommon in the intelligence world. Foreign languages and that. Well, they got to know me and discovered I'd majored in art at BYU, and had illustrated some books and stuff. That I had been playing guitar for then about 20 years, I'd say. That I was fluent in German and was competent at the time competent in Hebrew and Arabic, and that I like to write short stories and send them off to get rejected.
You always got to have something fun to do.
Yeah, they're thinking, we can't not try this guy out. We have to see if it might work. So one day they knock on my door and they say, we think we might be good at what you might be good at what we do. I said, what do you do? And they say, we can't tell you. I said, I want to know then, And then they gave me some psychology and personality profile tests like the Myers-Briggs, MMPI, kind of standard stuff with a few other more specialized assessment instruments thrown in. They said, if you score where we think you will with these tests, then we'll read you on and we'll offer you the chance to volunteer. Okay. So a week or two later, they said, okay, well, you scored really well. I said, okay, well, what does that mean? They said, come on over to the offices on the, well, first off, they had to clear it with my commander. No, they didn't. Okay, so how it worked is I had to go over their offices, which was really about a 5-minute walk from my quarters, and ramshackle old buildings. They were built as temporary buildings in World War II, and they were falling down. The paint was flaking off. The walls were splintered, and the raccoons were living under the crawl space underneath. There were squirrels in the attic.
It's a great place to start.
Yeah. Anyway, so I go in, and Tom is in the back, and Tom, you have to envision him. He's an Army captain. It says captain on his door, Captain Tom McNair. He's wearing an open collar shirt, jeans, and has a full beard. Not unlike any other Army officer I'd ever seen. I knew there were people who were really spies, the ones who case officers and stuff who would dress like that, but never somebody living on an Army installation like that. He sits me down and he says, okay, so you need to fill out this. And it was this, what we call in the civilian world, a non-disclosure form. And it was really draconian. It was stiffer than even for the top secret special department intelligence read-ons I'd had. This one was really strict. And so, okay, I don't know what to get into. And I fill it out, sign it, hand it back to him. He said, okay, our mission here is to collect intelligence against foreign threats using a parapsychology discipline known as remote viewing. We're inviting you to volunteer to become a psychic spy. And then he said, now you don't have to answer right now. Here are the 3 things you can tell your wife about this. And you can tell us in 24 hours whether you are willing to volunteer or not. If you don't volunteer, you're restricted by this paper you just signed, but otherwise we won't bother you again. And as he's saying this, I'm going, I used to believe in ESP. I decided it wasn't true. He's telling me there's a line item in the federal budget to pay people to become psychic spies. There is no way in hell I'm not signing up for this. I don't care what my wife says. and so, all right, then I said, no, that's not necessary. I can ask you right now. Yes, I want to do it. He was kind of surprised because I don't think anybody else had ever done that. That
Really?
they requested. They'd all said, okay, I'm going to think about it. And I frankly didn't even care if it ruined my career at that point. This was something I absolutely felt like I wanted to and felt like I should do. So that's how I got in.
When you have something that intriguing, I don't know how you can say no. I would imagine people did. I don't know.
They did. People
wow.
did.
I couldn't imagine saying no to that. What an opportunity. And because of that, you're here with all the other people teaching it to so many people. And, that's the other thing is when you first started. So they talk about remote viewing, and we've touched on it briefly, like, you're seeing things in different areas. And when you first started, did you visualize like, hey, I might be doing this later on? Or was it like, I'm just going in and just figuring out what I'm going to do?
Well, the fact is you have no idea what the future is going to look like from that perspective. Right. And my only worry at that point was if I got fired before I even got started because I couldn't do it. Right. And I think everybody has that worry that signed on, and probably still today. I mean, I don't know. Let me ask you a question.
Oh God. Okay, go ahead.
What were your feelings when you sat down that first day of class and I started the lectures? What were your thoughts about how it was going to turn out for you?
My thought was, first, I hoped I was listening good enough. So I was taking in as much information as I possibly could. I was like, please let me be like a sponge today.
Mm-hmm.
But then it was also I think the same worry. It was like, man, I don't want to screw this up. I don't want him to pick my butt out and say, man, you suck. It really is that, like, I tap into a lot of different things, but this was a whole new way of doing things. So yeah, there was that nervousness of like, can I do this? Can I really do what he's asking me to? And can I do it the way he's looking for? So absolutely, I agree with you. I was the same way.
Yeah, I think my feelings were, I think you can understand how I was feeling. Now, the stakes for me were a little bit higher because I left my previous assignment to come to this. And that was not, I won't say it wasn't available. The colonel that I had to get permission to leave from was sympathetic to the program, and he might have given me a job again back over there. Otherwise, I might have had to uproot my family and move somewhere else in the world to find a replacement job if I didn't make it there, if I didn't make the remote viewing program. But you know what? I also didn't know that I wouldn't succeed, right? It was totally like almost anything you undertake in life that's of any challenge at all. You won't know whether you succeed or not until you give it a try. And so I was looking forward, and I don't mean looking forward to, I mean looking forward, seeing willing and open-minded about what the future is going to present here. And I did succeed. I mean, in the first just experimental attempts, and then in the training, I did have some good success. So the worry was unnecessary, but it's natural that that's there.
And I think that's something, for you saying that for yourself going into this at the very first beginning, and now when you're teaching it, and for me, it was that worry of like, man, can I really do this the way that you're looking for? And realizing, and I want to say with you, when you went through and the other people that were in my class, you really took the time with us and you really helped us to get on that line, to understand the information behind everything you were teaching. You were so thorough on all of that. And, for anybody out there, it's so very thorough. You don't have to worry about if you're going to get it or not. You'll get what you need to get out of this class, because you will be doing the exercises, and you will be doing them with exactly what you need as you go through it.
I appreciate that. And the fact is, I've only had a few students who didn't succeed to some extent. In fact, I think if I only had one student, no, I had two students that didn't succeed at all. And one is because he didn't come intellectually equipped for the class. And that's hard to assess in the beginning, but he was actually, I think he was functionally illiterate. He didn't seem to be able to read or write worth anything, and I felt bad for him, but fortunately he was the only guy in the class. And that often happens universal. If I ever end up with a one-person class, this isn't universal, but because I've had one-person classes that were great,
Right.
If all kinds, how you have all kinds of things fall together and then a miracle happens, right? Well, if all kinds of things fall apart and you end up with one person, I always wonder if there's a reason for that, that the universe doesn't want me to disadvantage a bunch of other more prepared people with having to kind of shepherd a person who's less prepared through the class. And in this case, that was what happened. The guy, without me realizing it, there's no way to know it because he came across fine in his emails.
Right.
I wonder if he's having somebody write them for him or something, but he comes and he just was not equipped for it. But he was determined to get through the class. And in the end, I don't remember, I think he did actually have some success on one or two sessions, but it was a real struggle, a very difficult struggle. So that does happen occasionally, but by and large, most of my students have had at least some measure of success. And even the ones who didn't have as much as others, there's a lot of value in this class that has strictly to do with remote viewing and yet goes beyond remote viewing. And I think you probably experienced that as well. You learn things about yourself that you never knew. You learn things about human nature and human perception that you never knew. And those things are all valuable outside of the remote viewing framework as well as in.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things, it really learns. I felt it really helped you, a lot of and there was other people in the class, and we talked afterwards. And it was really a lot of learning to trust yourself and learning to trust when you're getting on that line. And then I've got to say, Paul, what you're pushing all of the extra vocabulary words. It's, like you never knew you knew so many words, and the words you start using to help describe the remote viewing, your target you're working on, and the descriptors on how to do that. So all of that together, it really does push you. And I've got to say, for this, I feel anybody that signs up for this, you really should be invested in yourself, invest in the class, invest your time, and be there like totally 100% in the class, and be paying attention to everything that's going on, because it is so worth it. You'll get out so much by really being conscious of what you're there for.
I like to joke with my students. I say, you came here and you thought you were just going to learn about remote viewing, but you're also learning a bit about psychology, perception, neuroscience, English vocabulary. I forget what all the other categories are. I remember one in the middle of the class, but literally this is a kind of a broad-based education in a lot of different fields that you'd never think would go together, but they all relate. They're all relevant to the remote viewing process. So,
it's almost like a college. What is it?
Marksmanship, even.
Marksmanship.
I'll leave that a secret until you take the class.
Oh, I can't wait for that one.
Well, you just won't remember. I'll remind you off camera.
Okay. But it is so interesting, and it's like a college course just crammed into a short time, and you are cramming all week. So be prepared for it.
Yeah, it's a lot of
So
work, and if you aren't willing to work, I don't want you here.
Yeah, and it's you're putting in so much of your own time and effort. People that are going to be there should really be wanting to be there. So very much.
Mhm.
So as you started going down this path and you started doing the remote viewing yourself and working in the class, at what point you finally discovered you were probably going to be staying? Because you were probably doing pretty good, I would think.
In the Army, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that it kept me if I wasn't providing useful, successful stuff. And I just stayed as long as they let me. I mean, I was already there for 7 years, which is more than twice as long as as an Army officer, you're normally in any assignment. The typical average, I don't know what the average is, but the typical long tour is 3 years, and then they move you on. They don't want you being stuck in one place doing the same thing over and over again. They want to, give you a broad experience. And even some of those are shorter, like you get short tours and long tours and stuff. So I was there for at least 3.5 tours worth of time, which is really unusual. Yeah, some of these specialty officer positions are like that, but not very many, I'll tell you. And so now I forgot where I was going with that. I was there for a long time.
So where did you want to go? I mean, you were working through that the whole time and you were really investing yourself in there.
Yeah.
And then they started bringing you in. So you started actually writing the program or helping to refine the program in there also?
Well, no, we needed to document what we had been trained. When I say we, that was Tom McNair. I think you mentioned some of these guys, if I remember right, or maybe you didn't. Tom McNair, he was kind of one class ahead of us. And not only one class ahead of us, he was sort of the proof principal for training military officers in CRV, control remote viewing. Did really well. Ingo considered him the best student he ever had. And thank goodness for that, because Tom was instrumental in helping us get our feet really on the ground with the later stages of remote viewing. So anyway, Tom, and then there was me and Bill Ray, who's still a great friend and protege. Charlene Schufelt, who's not active in the program anymore, or isn't active in remote viewing. And then as a kind of an afterthought was Ed Dame. Some folks know who he is. He belonged to a different unit, and that unit decided they wanted to get somebody trained as a remote viewer. And so they asked us to let him accompany us in the training phase, and they provided additional training funds to cover his training. And then afterwards he went back to his other unit for a long time. Then some years later he finally came back and came to Stargate was assigned. So that was us. Oh, I remember, we're talking about how do we document, what were we documenting? So we were the ones who trained with Ingo Swann, and because our commander knew that the contract with SRI was going to go away, in fact, it had gone away by the time we started this work. He wanted us to compile as accurate as possible document about what Ingo Swann had taught us. And so they called me the wordsmith, because I was actually quite competent. That had to do with my English writing skills, I think, quite confident in writing. And
that's where it comes from.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, it's surprising how useful the things you learn in your early life come in to play later on and when you get older, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So they made me I guess you'd call me the executive editor. I don't know. I was in charge of the project. And so I collected everybody's notes from the lectures and stuff, and requested their support in putting this all together. They of course reviewed all the manuscript stuff and added their suggestions and changes and such. And so it was a joint effort with me as the main facilitator. And we produced what was then called a coordinate remote viewing manual, which was printed by the Defense Intelligence Agency press, but not officially released as a document. So anything that's officially released has a document number on it, the DIA document number. This one did not, for various reasons. And they printed 30 copies. I have two of those original copies, one of which is heavily marked up, where I discovered things we got wrong, later on. I said, oh, dang it. That we left, for example, there's a series of different breaks you take in the process. We left out the miss break. And I thought that was ironic that we missed the miss break.
You missed the miss break.
Anyway, so yeah, and that of course got released on the internet in 1997. I was opposed to the idea, but I saw it was inevitable it was going to come out. And so the person who released it, Palin Gaynor, PJ Gaynor, she asked me to write a little intro to it. So I did. And I knew it was going to come out anyway. I might as well at least frame it in a way that people understand better what the point was. And so, yeah.
So what were some of the, and I don't know how much you can say, but some of the bigger things you worked on with remote viewing? So what were and I don't know what you can say, what you can't say, or even some of the things you worked on now as remote viewer after you've left. What are some of the targets or things, I guess, for people to understand what kind of targets, what kind of other things, physical targets you may be working on also, or the military?
I actually can talk about nearly everything.
Okay.
Mostly been declassified. Now there's still some targets that are probably still sensitive for various reasons. For example, during the 89, 90 and later time frame, we worked a lot of counter narcotics targets. That was a war on drugs. That was the only game in town at the time, because the Soviet Union had dissipated and was all in disarray, and so we didn't have a foreign threat at the time of any serious note, other than narco traffickers, which it's a low grade terminal infection if you think about it. This whole drug business.
No, that's true. That's true.
Infection, and so it was worthy of a war, but we didn't succeed in fighting it right, which is not a surprise. We always have trouble fighting wars, but we had a bunch of taskings on that, and some of those there are details I won't tell you today because it might implicate. There may still be bad actors out there who have bad taste in their mouth for things that we were able to accomplish.
Yeah, understandable.
Yeah. So generally speaking, I mean, we did anything that was a potentially important target to the intelligence community in general. We worked. So we worked Chinese nuclear tests, Soviet weapons R&D, decision making in the Politburo, silkworm missiles in Iran, location of silkworm missiles in Iran. They did a long series during the Tehran hostage crisis, Iranian hostage crisis, on trying to narrow down where hostages, U.S. hostages foreign hostages in general, were being held, what their situation was, what the circumstances, trying to get details. Counterintelligence stuff, we worked probably more than one, but one I was particularly involved in, trying to find a mole, the KGB mole in the CIA. And we actually described the guy. It turned out to be Aldrich Ames. If you want to look him up, he was really a bad actor, really bad.
I'll have to check that one out for sure.
But we actually successfully described him, but they didn't act on our information. They would have found him probably a year and a half earlier, and before some of his really egregious stuff, if they had actually gone back and reverse engineered what we produced as information. And some of it was actually actionable, but whatever.
And that's something I think a lot of people don't realize with remote viewing is you can actually view people versus just places, is doing remote viewing on people. And you also, we had touched on when I was there too, and another about tracking people live as they're moving is another thing you do with remote viewing. And that's something I think people don't realize, that remote viewing is getting into all of that.
Yeah, I don't know about the tracking thing. I mean, there are some potential there, but there are some things in remote viewing that are more easily done and more successfully done than others, which stands to reason. That's the way it is with everything in life, right?
Right.
Some things are harder for remote viewing to do, and some things are easier. So tracking people is one I put up there as kind of a harder thing to do, because it involves both identifying, describing people, but also a temporal element, time element, and moving from one place to another over time. And so There are anecdotal stories about how successes that we've had in doing that. But there's no really good statistical evidence about how well that works. We don't know how many times we tried it, it didn't work, right? So, but it is a doable thing. It can be done. I'm not going to reject that possibility, but it can be done. It's just how often you can do it successfully, I don't know.
Right. And so one of the things, like we had talked about, just drop that. We had talked about your dissertation and how you had talked about the physicalism is that and I just want to read the little blurb. Physicalism is a belief that everything in the universe is either physical or the result of things that are physical, both philosophically and science, including psychology, largely assume physicalism is true. But you did a dissertation on the falsehood of physicalism. So can you kind of go into just quickly, I don't know if you can do it quickly.
We'll see.
I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you're a
I'll
busy
give it a
guy.
stab. Yeah. In fact, I don't even know how long we've been on. A while, I guess.
Oh,
huh?
it's been almost an hour and a half. So I'm like,
Okay.
I don't want
Well,
to take up
maybe I'll wrap up with this, and then we'll have a revisit. And all the questions I didn't answer, or the topics I didn't answer, we can answer those next time, maybe. So yeah, the ruling doctrine is physicalism. Everything in the world is physical or a consequence of physical facts. And everybody, I think, pretty much understands that. They may not agree with it, but they understand it. Okay, and our scientific world is so arranged that if you can't come up with a causal explanation, if you can't come up with a physical explanation, or at least a speculatively physical or causal explanation, then it can't be real. Now that isn't what basically the logic says. The logic says that we don't know if it's real or not, right? But physicalists make that final leap and say it can't be real. Okay, if it's not physical, it doesn't exist. And the problem with that is it's based on a generalization, which is everything that we have thoroughly been able to investigate and find a causal solution to has been physical. Therefore, anything that we haven't been able to find a causal solution to or thoroughly investigate, we have to doubt that it is physical, and it probably isn't, right? It's essentially, it's not just a generalization, like, everything is this, right? It's also based on a induction, which is this has been true, this has been true, this has been true. Therefore, all of these kinds of things are going to be true. Well, we know that's actually a logical fallacy, and induction is not actually logical. Okay,
Right.
Because you can find a counter. If you can find a counterexample, you disprove that. And physicalism is such that we make this generalization that everything is physical, but if we ever find something that isn't physical, it disproves that. The physicals is say you can't find anything that's physical. It's like that old joke. There's two rules in this company. The first rule is the boss is always right. Rule 2 is if the boss is ever wrong, see rule number 1. Right. In
sounds like
physicalism,
kind of a military thing in here.
yeah, well, you know what? The military is actually better about this kind of a thinking. They realize because lives can depend on false assumptions.
Right.
And the military will get into these false assumptions, circular logic kind of things, and then they'll get their counterexample and they'll change. Right. The scientific world doesn't do that quite as easily. So the problem, of course, is then it becomes if you ever do show up with something that really looks like it's non-physical, the physicals will say then that it isn't real. Right? It's the boss is always right. You show me a place where the boss is wrong. Yeah, the boss is always right. Right. And so my dissertation essentially went quite exhaustively through 4 parapsychology, psychological, scientific experimental paradigms that all of which have been replicated, all of which have been demonstrated in a variety of laboratories under a variety of conditions, all of which have had success. Not always, but no scientific experiment always has success. Well, there might be a few, but there are plenty of accepted science experiments that have a certain level of failures. So there is a large body of very robust, scientifically developed evidence for parapsychology. And parapsychology violates some of the premises of physicalism. Essentially, it's more logical or more probable that it's that parapsychology shows a non-physical element in the universe than it will ever be subsumed under physicalism. And therefore, that's true. There's a high probability that physicalism is false, despite the fact that mainstream science is afraid to reach that conclusion. And it is a fear. I was just thinking, and when I was swimming laps this morning, I was thinking about skeptics and how they point their fingers at parapsychology and say, oh, you guys have got this a priori assumption that there's something there. And that's not true of all. There is a few parapsychologists are like that, but the majority of them are open-minded about it. But there is an absolute dogmatism in physicalism that has been inculcated, that has been essentially, I'm trying to think of the right word I want here, intentionally, drilled into every physicalist, that there is nothing except physicalism. They're dogmatic about it. And if you ever threaten that, of course, it's standard with anybody, it doesn't have to be in science or anything else. If you have a certain worldview and something comes along that threatens that worldview, you get real crazy. It becomes threatening to your almost threatening your sense of identity in a way, because our notions, our worldviews, our notions about the universe tend to kind of get incorporated into our senses, our sense of personal identity. And when you start threatening that, it's like a Catholic or a Protestant or even a Mormon like I am. You come up with something that seems to show that one of your truth claims is false, then you get into the pushback mode. People point to religion, call it dogmatism. They won't point to science and call physicalism dogmatism, right? And yet it has all the characteristics.
I like that because, one of the things for me, my beliefs and what I believed in is constantly changing. And like when you talk about the physicalism, a lot of people will say, well, you can't physically see that or physically experience it, but it's like, but there are ways that it all works. And really remote viewing is a good example.
And of course, that's an argument that dates back to Descartes. The idea of dualism, that there's mind and then there's body, that they're two different domains. The pushback was that, well, how could a non-physical thing even affect the physical universe? And it's kind of a rhetorical question, but they expect you to draw the conclusion that, well, it can't. And my answer, and a few other folks, Kurt DeKoss, a philosopher, said, well, why not? Because it's not physical. Well, okay, but maybe they're bridge principles, bridge lines. There aren't all kinds of other physical things where one feature of the universe can affect another feature of the universe, even though they don't seem to share anything in between, right? It's more complicated than that, because usually you will find bridge conditions that interact with both of them, right? But then my point here is, well, why couldn't there be similar bridge conditions between physical and non-physical? And if we didn't have anything like remote viewing or psychokinesis or whatever like that, if we didn't have any evidence that those things work, I'd probably be siding with the physicalists, right? But I've seen these things work. I absolutely know they work. So when a physicalist says, no, that can't possibly work, I said, well, it did. What are you going to do about it? And at that point, it's time to start looking for what the bridge principles are, or at least try to. But the fact is, people say, well, you can't research non-physical things. I said, well, if a non-physical thing does have some impact on the physical universe, then you can. It may be indirect. It's kind of like trying to research physical, microparticles in physics. You can't look at those things. We have nothing that can allow you to look at them. So you have to do indirect measurement, like cloud chambers. You follow their tracks in a smoke filled chamber, or various things. You see their effects. In fact, I just read an interesting article today about there's an astral body out beyond Pluto, and I can't think of the name of it. It's kind of an odd name. It's like a mini planet, even smaller than Pluto. It's got rings around it.
I've heard of it. I can't think of the name.
Yeah, we can't see the rings. And so they had to indirectly detect that they were there, right? And that's kind of how they detect these exoplanets around distant star systems, is by, they can't take pictures of, they can't get any imagery, they can't get any, so they measure them, they measure their existence indirectly, right? So why can't you do that between the non-physical and physical realm, assuming the existence of either? Because some people think the physical realm doesn't exist. The idealists, is philosophical idealism, but I'm not quite that radical.
Well, I
Anyway.
like the fact that work for everything when you're doing this, even with remote viewing. I mean, you're keeping track of, like, say with the assignments I'm doing. You're keeping track of them with the homework assignments and with all the people you're working with and all the way through. And with Hal Puthoff, you guys have been documenting all of this along the way to prove more of this. The physicalism isn't quite what they're saying it is.
Yeah, it's there's lots of things I wish I documented and failed to, but I try to document what I can, right, reasonably. But I also am very cautious with the word prove.
Right.
People say, well, has that been scientifically proved? And I'll say, science doesn't prove anything. And it doesn't. Proof is a nonsense word in science. It applies in math, it applies in the law, but it doesn't apply in science. Science doesn't prove anything. What they do is they develop evidence for or against competing hypotheses. And then if you come up with evidence that discounts a certain hypothesis, you get rid of that until you narrow things down to one hypothesis, and then that becomes a theory, essentially. Okay. And then you develop evidence to support that theory, and the theory becomes more and more well attested. But you never can know if your theory is actually fully true. It's impossible. I did a fair amount of studying in philosophy and science, so I understand this conundrum. Hempel has this. Carl Hempel is a philosopher in the in the first half of the most of the 1900s, right? And part of the Vienna Circle. Let me see if I can remember his axiom. It was the only thing we know about, and I'm paraphrasing this because I can't remember exact wording, right?
Right. I'll let you off the hook.
The one thing we are certain about in our current science is that it is false. Okay. Because either a theory is incomplete or it's wrong, and it'll get replaced by another theory later on, like the original geocentric theory of the solar system, which was that the Earth was the center and everything else went around it. That was replaced by the heliocentric theory, which is where the sun is the center and then everything goes around the sun, right? That's an example of how, as Thomas Kuhn would say, a scientific revolution, right? One better theory replaces the older theory. That can happen with every theory. That could happen with every theory we have today, because we don't know what future discoveries, how that might change what we understand and know about the universe today. And so Hempel says, all we know is that they're false, and he means false in the sense of either they're not complete, there are holes in it that some of which we know, some of which we don't realize are holes. And then there are some that we just know aren't right. They're just as close as we have gotten so far, right? And he says the problem is that we have no idea what a fully realized science, in other words, a science that is actually correct, would look like, because that is somewhere out there in the universe. We haven't got there yet. And so we know that ours is false. We don't know what a true one would look like. And that's where we are.
And that's something I think everybody should really think about. Things are not quite as maybe you've been told, and to look beyond and stretch your beliefs and look and learn. For me, I guess I like to encourage people, learn, investigate, look it up, see what you can find out, and pursue it, and go down that road, and don't worry about what you may discover, but just worry about looking at what can I discover, and not worry about what the end result of it's going to be. And that's one thing I know we've been taking up a lot of your time. So
let me respond to that, because that's an
okay.
important point. I absolutely agree with that, but I want to add a caveat.
Okay.
I tend to suggest you don't necessarily accept something as true, A, just because it's different than what other people are saying, and B, because it sounds good. Because there are a lot of these other theories, squishy theories, non-scientific theories. Some of those are probably right, or at least have elements of truth in them. but there's a bunch of stuff out there just wrong, right?
Yeah.
And it's particularly true in the fields we circulate in, because people have their favorite theories because they feel good, not necessarily because they actually are legitimate. The dark side of that is conspiracy theories, where people think of some possible thing that could be happening, and then they assume because it's possible, it means it's really real. And in either case, it's really good to learn as much as you can about everything and learn how to think critically. That's absolutely crucial. Absolutely
Yes,
crucial.
absolutely. I totally agree with you that, because like I said, there's so many things I used to believe, and the more I'm learning and the more I'm understanding, I don't believe most of what I used to believe. So, and that's one of the other things people say, well, you're a hypocrite. Now you're saying this. Like, no, it's just you change
I'm
your
smarter than I
beliefs.
was.
That's a good one. We're all smarter.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Some people are not, and that's the sad thing. There are some people who don't learn from their experiences.
yeah,
They go on their emotions, exclusively on their emotions. They go for what feels good to them at the moment. And I mean, you think about it, some narcotics feel good to you at the moment, but downstream it's not, they don't pay off, so.
no. So I just wanted to say thank you, Paul, and I want to let people know. So I'm just going to give a little overview. For your site, there's controlled remote viewing classes, basic, intermediate, advanced, and tune-ups. There are courses, the practical application remote viewing courses. There's associated remote viewing, ARV, operational remote viewing, dowsing, sketching for remote viewers, a full course, and one-day courses. You also have home study courses. You can learn technical dowsing, remote perception, basic operational training, and your author of course, your book, and I'll say again, I've got it right here, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, the Secret Military Perception Skill, and it's anyone can learn. And for people to really go in, check out his website, ourviewer.com, go on his Facebook, YouTube, he's on Twitter and LinkedIn, and check out his stuff. And honestly, Paul's like everywhere when you start looking for him.
I just can't keep my mouth shut,
What would you say to anybody who's looking at taking your course? Why would you encourage them to take your course, and what do you feel they'd learn from it?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, of course, that depends on the person, what they need, what they're looking for, what they're willing to submit to, right? But if you really are looking to learn remote viewing in general, controlled remote viewing in particular, mine is really the most complete and most vetted course of any available out there. It's more expensive. I'm not going to tease you about that, because I limit my classes to 2 students per instructor, which means most of my classes only have 4 students in them and 2 instructors. And only on rare occasions do I add more students, but I also add more instructors. So, so you get the most direct attention, and it is a week and change long, which most classes are just over the weekend of, my competitors out there. And I've been doing this longer than anybody else. I've been teaching control remote viewing longer than anybody else active out there. Essentially quite a bit longer than anybody else out there. Now, just an interesting sideline most people don't know, I've also continued to try and improve my classes. And I realized to do that, I also need to improve my own understanding and capacity in education, right? So I have taken classes in how to teach better. I've looked into a lot of different approaches to that. I've continued my education in human perception and psychology and neuroscience, all of which crosswalk here. So, excuse me, my classes today are far better than my classes when I first started out. And those classes weren't bad at all. So I learn as I go too. That's the way life is. And if you're not learning as you go and improving as you go, then you're kind of missing out on the best things you can have when you're, during the 70 to 80 to hopefully 90 years you get here. So
Absolutely. And I've got to attest, when I was in his class, he was constantly like, I'm going to tweak that for the next one. I'm going to tweak that for the next one. So constantly going, but the classes are amazing. I highly encourage you to do that. Get on his website, and he's also got targets on his website. You can go in and do practice targets and just go through and look at his information, use his book. He has downloadable different ones you can do online, his classes, if you can't make it in person. His in-person classes
Well,
are worth.
let me add a caveat. My fully
Okay,
vetted CRV classes are not available online and won't be.
okay,
There are some essential elements in those that just aren't translatable into the digital world. My remote perception basic operational training is actually a digital form of my basic course. But it's a four hours of DVD training, and my classes are 40 hours long. So you see that there's stuff left out, right?
oh yeah.
But it's way better than nothing.
It's a great way to segue into it, to see
Yeah.
like, hey, what do I like this? And would I want to take it further? Because, for me, I just jumped in with both feet, because why not? But
Well, and if you live in, like, say Tashkent or Azerbaijan, right, and you want to learn how to remote view and you just can't get to the United States, then that's it. Actually, I've had a lot of folks email me and call me and say that, for not being a live course, that was really, really useful. So it's a good approach too. So
oh, absolutely. And I've recommended it to other people already. So with that, I just want to thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate your time. I know we went way over what we originally planned, so I apologize for that. But I just want to thank Paul for being here. And for those of you, make sure to check out his website, ourviewer.com. There's so much information you want to look into remote viewing further. And with that, I just want to thank you so much, Paul. And I want to remind everybody, remember the first and third Tuesdays of the month on Edge Talk Radio, and we have lots more to come. So thank you so much, Paul.
well,
And
thank you. I should thank you for the opportunity to talk at length.
thank you all for bearing with us. And I felt Paul had so much great information to share, and I'm hoping you will think so too. And with that, I wish all of you an absolutely amazing day, and I can't wait to have you listen next time. Thank you so much.